Hi, it's Bob Weathers here. I've been working for the last several years side by side with John Dupuy, Bence Ganti, and Dennis Wittrock in the Ken Wilber Gratitude Fund. And we've been the trustees of that, and some of you have received communications from us, sometimes signed by me, in fact, as we reach out to encourage individuals like you who are viewing this video right now, who have been impacted by the work of Ken Wilber and integral theory. I was initially going to write a little something to go out in the this January 2020 letter to celebrate Ken's birthday. I was going to write something, and then I just viewed Bence's video that he did in terms of how he met Ken Wilber. I was so touched by it, I thought, forget about writing. I'll just share with you in 5 or 10 minutes some reflections about who Ken Wilber has been to me down through the decades. I first came in contact with Ken Wilber's writings right after I started graduate school. This is 2020, and I started graduate school a little over 40 years ago, September of 1979. And early in 1980, so exactly 40 years ago, I was introduced to Ken Wilber's earliest writings. The first book I read by him was his first book, The Spectrum of Consciousness. And next came No Boundary and The Atman Project and A Sociable God, just one after the other. It's interesting. I in undergraduate work, before I went to graduate school, I'd been a double major in psychology and religious studies. And at that point in the United States, I was only aware of one program that offered graduate studies where I could study clinical psychology on the one hand and religious studies on the other. And it happened to be Fuller Seminary in Pasadena. So that's where I applied. By the time I got to Fuller, I was definitely on my way out of conventional religion, including Christianity. And it was a evangelical Christian seminary. So it was an interesting journey through Fuller. But what I want to say is that it was a 6-year doctoral program. I got my master's in religious studies along the way and my doctorate in clinical psychology. Is that every step of the way, virtually within a few months of my starting graduate school, Ken Wilber's books accompanied me. One of my early and best friends that I made at Fuller has continued to be a dear friend of mine, Jim Finley. Jim is a Roman Catholic by background. He was a monk at Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky, and his spiritual director was Thomas Merton. Jim has spoken and written widely, and you may have encountered some of his writings. He works very closely with Richard Rohr and Cynthia Bourgeault these days. Jim and I continue to be very close. We've been meeting together for 40 years, about every week or two for breakfast or lunch. So we've gotten to know each other well. Jim told me years and years ago that in his work with Thomas Merton, that Merton told Jim that in his view, there were lots of people that were anonymous Christians. And I've reflected on that, thinking that I think that maybe I've been kind of an anonymous Wilberian or an anonymous integralist. In many ways, I have been, I guess. So I went through that 6-year doctoral program. I did my dissertation on mindfulness meditation back in the early 1980s. I was in communication with Ken. We corresponded. It's while he was living up in Tahoe, and he was very supportive of my dissertation. His work, particularly his book Eye to Eye, formed the basis theoretically of my doctoral dissertation. And I was very grateful for that. It meant a lot to me to correspond with him and receive his blessing. I got out of graduate school and felt very supported in my spirituality. Was very deep into Buddhist meditation practice, and that's continued all these years. I got out of graduate school and was immediately hired at Pepperdine University in their graduate school here in the Los Angeles area. And I taught there for 15 years. Pepperdine itself was affiliated with evangelical Christianity. And though I was not of that tribe, I was highly valued at Pepperdine because I brought together psychology and spirituality in a way that students really appreciated. And to tell you the truth, and speaking of anonymous, I introduced graduate level students. I started by teaching in the master's program. In the last number of years, I taught in the doctoral program. I introduced hundreds of students to Wilber's ideas, and did so in many ways anonymously. I taught courses on history and systems of psychology, and Ken's work was in the back of my mind. His understanding of epistemology, the impact he'd had on me philosophically. And then clinically, I was very drawn, always have been drawn. Before I began reading Ken Wilber's writings, my bachelor's thesis in college was on holistic approaches to psychology. So Ken's writings amplified in so many ways intuitions I'd had for a very long time. And now I could make those explicit. So I did those over all the years of my teaching in the graduate school at Pepperdine. He was very much with me during that time. I required textbooks of his. When Sex, Ecology, Spirituality came out, my students were reading that. It was heavy duty reading for sure, but I was delighted to introduce them to Ken's concepts. I had no direct communication with Ken during that time. And I had started off in the 80s involved in the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, which kind of morphed and evolved into being more and more integrally informed, but I didn't continue that involvement. I got deeply into studying the Jungian psychology. I went through the training program at the Jung Institute here in Los Angeles. And Ken's writings actually provided kind of a backdrop for my assimilating that material as well as critiquing it. And so his spirit continued very much with me. That brings us into the new millennium. And I want to update you about the last 20 years. I began in midlife to become addicted to alcohol and then other drugs. It's an unusual trajectory. But when I got into recovery about 10 years ago, there was no question that whatever recovery was going to look like for me would be informed by an integral perspective. I was so steeped in it personally and philosophically and practice-wise and so on. And so I reached out to see who's been writing in this area. And there'd been one article up in San Francisco, but nothing in that area. And I thought maybe I need to be the one to write in this area. And then I met John Dupuy, and John and I have been best friends ever since then. I applied John's writings in integral recovery, and then soon enough I met Guy Duplessis, who had also written 2 books, now 3 books, Integral Approaches to Addiction Recovery. And again, and during this time is when I met Ken in person. I met him at a few different Boulder conferences, the Boulder Conference on Christianity, the Boulder Conference on the Fourth Turning, and I got a chance through John to meet him in his loft to spend a good chunk of time with Ken Wilber in person, which was glorious to me. So Ken's been very much with me in my own personal recovery process. And for most of the last 10 years, I've been working in treatment here in Southern California. And the work I do as a recovery coach, as my work priorly as a university professor of psychology, is thoroughly drenched in Ken Wilber's inspiration. And so I'm now introducing young men and women, for the most part, who are in recovery from severe addiction, oftentimes to heroin and methamphetamine. I introduce them to concepts of Ken's. I do a lot of translating, and so I don't talk technically about spiral dynamics. I just teach it. I'll discuss something a lot when I supervise staff. I'll make for example, the Aqua model explicit, but most often it's implicit. And the last piece I want to share with you before I finish up this little personal introduction to my introduction to Ken Wilber and my lifelong relationship to Ken is in the last few years, I'm a drummer. I'm a lifelong drummer. In the last few years, I've been writing for a drum magazine, 21st Century Drummer. And just this last summer, I had a chance to go to England and interview kind of a Hall of Fame drummer, Bill Bruford from the groups Yes and King Crimson is where he made most of his fame. And I sat with him, and Bill has become an academic. He retired from music 10 years ago, got his doctorate in musicology, and I sat with Bill and we did an interview, and then just this January, this month, published 3 articles that are related to those conversations with Bill Bruford. And I'm so aware that that these are explicitly integral in form. My conversation with Bill was more implicitly informed by Ken Wilber, but I've developed an infographic that's actually in the latest issue of 21st Century Drummer, and it is explicitly integral. And I give ample attention to Ken Wilber. So I'm introducing Ken Wilber to drummers, to individuals who are in recovery from addiction, and prior to that, decades of teaching clinical psychologists and therapists all over the country. So my work continues these days. Thoroughly indebted to you, Ken, and will be grateful to give back in any way that I can, as long as I have breath, to you for being the central inspiration of now 40 years of work. So grateful to you and wish you a happy birthday, Ken.